My parents called my husband the help at our own wedding reception. They told me I was throwing my life away on a man who unclogged toilets for a living. They cut me off financially, socially, and emotionally the same week I came home from my honeymoon. 4 years later, their business empire collapsed, their friends abandoned them, and every single one of them came knocking on the door of the woman they disowned. And what happened next is something I am still processing every single day. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think when they hear a story like this. The beginning isn't the wedding, and it isn't even meeting Marcus. The beginning is the house I grew up in, and the particular, suffocating species of ambition that lived inside it like mold behind the walls, invisible until you looked closely, and then impossible to unsee. My parents, Richard and Claudette, and I'll use their names because at this point in the story they forfeited the softening effect of mom, and dad, at least for a while, built their lives around the idea of appearances in a way that I don't think was ever a conscious choice so much as a deeply inherited religion. My grandfather on my father's side had been working class. A factory man. Good hands, bad back, retired at 62 and spent his last years watching baseball and eating my grandmother's cooking, and by all accounts have gathered over the years, being genuinely happy. My father loved his father and was also, in a way he never fully acknowledged, deeply ashamed of him. Not of the man himself, my grandfather was kind and funny and steady, the kind of man who remembered every person he'd ever met by name, but of the category of life he represented. The ordinary life, the life without edge or ambition or visible success. My father spent his entire adult existence running from that category. He got an MBA, he started a consulting firm that did reasonably well. He married my mother who came from a family with slightly more pretension and slightly less actual money than they liked to project, and together they built a life that looked from the outside like wealth and ease and arrival. The right neighborhood, the right school for my sister and me, the right cars changed every 3 years, the right vacations. The right charitable donations to the right organizations, so that their names appeared in the right programs. I want to be careful here not to make my parents into cartoons, because the truth is more complicated than that, and I think the more complicated version is more honest. They were not evil people. They were not intentionally cruel most of the time. They loved my sister and me genuinely, in the particular way that people who have built their identity around achievement love their children. Which is to say, they loved the versions of us they had planned for, and struggled enormously with the versions of us that diverged from those plans. My sister diverged very little. She went to the right college, got the right degree, married an orthodontist named Todd who plays golf and says absolutely instead of yes, and has never once in his life questioned whether the path he was on was the right one. My parents adore Todd. They've adored Todd since the moment my sister brought him home, because Todd was legible to them. Todd was a confirmation of everything they believed about how a life should be organized. I was the other kind. I was the one who asked too many questions, who read the wrong books, who cried at commercials and argued with my father at dinner about things he considered closed topics. I was the one who majored in English literature at the school they'd chosen for me, and then had the nerve to say I didn't want to go to law school afterward. My mother used to look at me sometimes with an expression I can only describe as puzzled grief, like she was trying to figure out where she'd gone wrong. I wasn't rebellious in any dramatic sense, no dyed hair, no screaming matches, no running away. I was just persistently, quietly myself, and in that particular household that was its own kind of rebellion. I met Marcus when I was 25. I had a job I actually liked, working for a small non-profit that did housing advocacy work. It didn't pay well, but it made me feel useful in a way that nothing else ever had, and I'd gotten to the point where I'd stopped apologizing for that to my parents, which had required approximately 2 years of therapy and one very honest conversation with my therapist about the difference between love and approval. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment that I'd furnished almost entirely from estate sales, and a very good eye for what could be recovered with a coat of paint. My parents had offered to help me with rent multiple times, and I had declined multiple times, because I'd already understood by then that their help always came with a structure attached to it, an invisible set of requirements you didn't discover until you'd already failed to meet them. The apartment's bathroom sink started draining badly in October. I waited 2 weeks hoping it would resolve itself in the way that people who don't want to deal with things hope plumbing issues will resolve themselves, which is to say it did not resolve itself, and in fact got worse. My landlord sent someone over on a Wednesday morning. Marcus showed up at my door at 9:15 carrying a toolbox and wearing a grey Henley with the sleeves pushed up. And I want to be clear that I did not have some cinematic moment of immediate overwhelming attraction, because real life doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you it does is leaving out the part where they were also nervous and awkward, and said something slightly embarrassing. What I noticed was that he was easy to be around. He looked at the sink, asked me a couple of questions about how it had been behaving, and then got to work without any of the performative sighing or teeth-sucking that I'd experienced with other tradespeople who seemed to want you to understand how complicated and serious their job was before they started doing it. He was just calm, quietly competent. He worked for about 40 minutes, talking occasionally, asking me about the plant on the windowsill, a fiddle-leaf fig I'd been nursing along, and somewhere in the middle of him explaining that the fig would do better with indirect light, I realized I'd been standing in my own kitchen for 20 minutes when I could have been doing literally anything else, just because I didn't want to leave the room. He left his number for follow-up, which is standard. I called it 2 days later about the sink, which was functioning perfectly. I knew this and he probably knew this. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked me to dinner that weekend, and I said yes, and the rest of it built the way these things build when they're real, slowly, and then suddenly, and then in a way that makes the time before it feel like something you were only half awake for. By the time I introduced Marcus to my parents, we had been together for 9 months. I had waited that long partly because I knew what was coming, and I wanted the relationship to be solid enough to survive it, and partly because I was hoping that if I gave my parents enough time to hear me talk about this person, his laugh, his mind, the way he could fix absolutely anything and also somehow always knew when to be quiet, and when to say something, they would arrive at the introduction already prepared to see a human being and not a job title. I told them about him in pieces, his sense of humor, his family who are warm and big and loud and nothing like mine, the fact that he'd started his own business at 28 and had 4 employees and was genuinely good at what he did. I told them he was a plumber last, deliberately, about a week before the dinner, braced for the response. My mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, I'm sure he's a very nice person." The way she said nice person is genuinely difficult to transcribe. It had a particular weight to it, the way interesting has weight when someone uses it to describe a meal they didn't enjoy. Nice person meant, I have already filed this in a category, and I am waiting for you to realize the mistake you are making. My father said, a plumber, HM. He said this like he was chewing on something he was eventually going to have to spit out. The dinner itself was technically fine in the way that things can be technically fine, while being quietly excruciating for everyone present. My mother asked Marcus questions with the calibrated politeness of someone conducting a job interview for a position they'd already decided wasn't going to be filled. My father talked mostly about his business and the market and various topics that felt chosen for their exclusivity. Like he was drawing a border around the kind of conversation that interested him and seeing whether Marcus would notice where it was. Marcus noticed. Marcus was not stupid, not by a significant margin. He had read more books than my father, held opinions on more subjects, and had the particular intelligence of someone who has spent years diagnosing invisible problems and tracing them back to their source. But he was also generous in a way my father was not, and so he engaged where he was invited, held back where he wasn't, and thanked my mother for the dinner at the end of the evening with a warmth that she received with a thin, practiced smile. In the car on the way home, Marcus was quiet. I asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I think they love you and I think that's enough for right now." He said it without bitterness, without scorekeeping, and I thought, this is the person I want to spend my life with, not because of the sentiment exactly, but because of the absence of the thing that wasn't there, the hurt, the pride, the need to have been seen correctly. He wasn't performing equanimity. He just had it like a structural thing built deep. My parents called me the following day. My father said what he had to say quickly, like pulling a bandage, which was the most merciful thing he did in this entire situation. "We don't think this is right for you. We think you're making a mistake. We hope you'll think carefully before this goes any further." My mother elaborated over the following week in a series of phone calls and texts that I will summarize as follows. Marcus was not the kind of man who could give me the life I deserved. The life I deserved was defined, apparently, by financial security, social standing, and the good opinion of people my parents respected. The fact that I had a different definition of the life I deserved was not something that entered the conversation as a serious proposition. When I told my mother that I was genuinely happy, genuinely in love, that Marcus was kind and smart and funny and honest, and made me feel more like myself than anyone I had ever been with, she said, Happiness isn't enough, sweetheart. You'll understand that later. I am 31 years old now. I understand it differently than she meant, but I understand it. I said several things over the months that followed that I am not sure I'd say exactly the same way now, though I don't regret the substance of any of them. I told my father that his opinion of my relationship was not something I'd asked for. I told my mother that the version of success she'd built her life around was not a version I wanted, and that I needed her to hear me say that and take it seriously instead of waiting for me to grow out of it. I told them both, in a conversation that I had steeled myself for 3 days, that I was going to marry Marcus, that I was going to be happy, and that I would very much like them to be part of that life, but that I needed them to decide whether that was possible for them, because I wasn't going to keep asking. My father told me that if I went through with it, he'd cut me off. I said, okay. He seemed genuinely surprised that I said okay. I think some part of him had believed until that moment that the money was the last wall in the negotiation. The fact that it wasn't changed something in his face. I saw it. He went very still for a moment, and then he went back to looking like himself, which was how I knew we'd crossed from disagreement into something harder. Marcus and I got married on a June Saturday at a small venue in the countryside about 40 minutes outside the city. We had 87 guests. My parents were not among them. My sister came quietly after a great deal of agonizing. I know because she told me about the agonizing afterward, and stood in the second row with her husband Todd, who to his credit behaved impeccably and hugged Marcus at the reception, and said, in what I think was genuine admiration, "You've got a great woman there, man." My sister cried during the vows. Later she told me she'd been crying partly out of joy for me, and partly out of something more complicated. Some grief for the fact that our family was broken open at a seam she hadn't fully known was there. That the thing our parents had spent 30 years building as a fortress had turned out to be a very particular kind of cage. And watching me walk out of it made her feel things about her own choices that she hadn't been prepared to feel at a wedding. Marcus's family was everything mine was not. His mother, Gloria, a woman of 62 with grey-streaked braids and a laugh that could fill a parking lot, wrapped me in a hug at the rehearsal dinner that lasted long enough that I had to blink hard to stay composed. His father, older and quieter, pressed both my hands in his at the altar and said, "Welcome, baby girl." His brothers were boisterous and competitive, and immediately started giving Marcus grief about his vows, which were beautiful in that particular way brothers have of expressing love entirely through cheerful mockery. His aunts brought food. There was so much food. I ate things at that wedding that I am still thinking about. We drove to Portugal for our honeymoon, which Marcus had planned meticulously over 6 months, reading travel forums and handwriting a list of specific restaurants and viewpoints, and a small ceramics village in the Alentejo region that turned out to be the most beautiful place I have ever stood in my life. We came home tan and tired, and so suffused with the specific joy of early marriage, that the reality of my family's absence took a few weeks to hit me with its full weight. When it did hit me, it hit hard. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from being rejected by the people who were supposed to be your original home, and it doesn't go away just because you know intellectually that you made the right choice. I cried in the shower a lot in those first months. I called my therapist more than usual. I had nights where I'd lie awake next to Marcus, who was sleeping the completely unbothered sleep of a man with a clean conscience, and I'd feel simultaneously certain that I'd chosen correctly and devastated by what that choice had cost. My mother called me once about 2 months after the wedding. She asked how I was doing in the careful, clinical voice she developed for our relationship. I said I was doing well. She said she hoped so. She said she missed me. I said I missed her too, which was the complicated truth, because you can miss someone and also understand that being near them is damaging to you, and those two things don't cancel each other out. They just coexist in your chest like two badly fitted pieces of furniture, taking up space. My father did not call. He wrote me a letter, actual paper envelope handwritten about 3 months in, which surprised me enough that I read it 3 times. It was measured in tone. It said that he loved me, that this was not a situation he'd wanted, and that he hoped someday I would understand the position he'd been in. It did not say he was wrong. It did not say he was sorry. It said I hope you understand the position he'd been in, which is the thing people say when they want absolution without accountability, when they want the resolution seen without having done the work that earns it. I wrote back. I said I loved him too. I said I understood he'd acted from his values and I needed him to understand I'd acted from mine, and that until he could sit with that without needing to change it, I wasn't sure what there was to say. He didn't write again. In the meantime, Marcus and I were building something. I want to spend some real time on this part of the story, because I think it gets flattened in the telling of things like this. The building something part gets summarized in a sentence while all the drama gets the detail, and that imbalance always bothered me because the building was actually the best part of everything. So let me tell you about it properly. Marcus's business was called simply Ray's Plumbing, his last name, uncomplicated, on the side of a white van. He'd started it at 28 after working for a larger company for 5 years and deciding he was tired of doing excellent work and watching someone else's name get the credit for it. He had 4 employees when we got married. His cousin Danny, a guy named Pete who had arms like bridge cables and a very gentle manner, a newer hire named Olu who was 23 and frighteningly good at diagnostics, and a part-timer named Sylvia who handled commercial jobs and also knew more about local building code than anyone I've ever met. He ran it with the same qualities he brought to everything: calm, detailed, honest about timelines and costs in a way that made customers uncomfortable at first because they'd been trained by 1,000 contractors to expect the reverse. His reviews were extraordinary. He answered his phone. He showed up when he said he would. I was doing my non-profit work, which had evolved since we'd been together. I'd moved into a more senior role, working on policy advocacy at the city level, which meant a lot of tedious meetings and a lot of small incremental victories that looked like nothing from the outside but mattered enormously in aggregate. It was still not financially glamorous. We were comfortable but not lavish. We lived in a house we'd bought, modest, 3 bedrooms, a backyard that Marcus converted into a genuine garden with a pergola he built himself over one extended weekend while listening to podcasts. And we had a life that fit us in the way good lives do, when you've built them to your own measurements instead of someone else's. I made friends I'd never have made in the orbit of my parents' world. Gloria became over time something close to a second mother to me, the kind of mother whose love didn't come with a rubric attached. Marcus's brother Darnell and his wife Kezia became 2 of our closest friends. My co-worker Fran, who had a barbed and brilliant sense of humor and strong opinions about tax policy, became the kind of friend I talked to every day. I was in a book club. I had a vegetable garden, imperfectly maintained. I got a dog, a 3-legged rescue mutt named Barnaby who became, immediately, the most important person in the house according to everyone including Marcus, who had claimed for years to be a cat person, and was now regularly photographed asleep on the couch with Barnaby arranged on top of him like a fur stole. I was happy, not in the thin surface way that comes from everything going according to plan, but in the denser, more complicated way that comes from knowing you chose your own life and are living inside it fully. There were hard parts. There were arguments and stresses, and the ordinary frictions of 2 people building a shared existence. Marcus worked long hours during busy seasons and sometimes came home too tired to talk. I had months at work where the gap between what needed to happen and what was actually possible narrowed to something demoralizing. We disagreed about money sometimes, about priorities, about how much of our time to give to things that mattered to both of us but in different proportions. We were real, in other words. We were not a fairy tale. But we were solid, and we were honest, and we were, I think, genuinely good for each other in ways that I am still understanding as we go. My sister came back into my life properly about 18 months into our marriage. She didn't announce it dramatically. She just started texting more regularly, then calling. Then one Sunday she drove 40 minutes to our house with a bottle of wine and sat on our porch, while Marcus grilled and Barnaby terrorized the backyard, and we talked for 4 hours about everything we hadn't been saying. She told me that living between me and my parents was more exhausting than she'd let on. She told me that Todd had asked her recently whether she was happy, really happy, and that the question had taken her longer to answer than she'd expected. She told me that she'd been watching my life from a distance and noticing things. I didn't push her on what things, I just let her talk. I want to say very clearly that I did not know what was coming for my parents' financial situation until it was already upon them. I want to say that because I've told this story to people and a few of them have implied that it's a little too convenient, that the timing works out a little too neatly for the person who walked away from wealth to have that wealth evaporate. As if I'd had some foreknowledge. I had nothing. I was genuinely, entirely unprepared for what happened, and so was my sister, and so apparently were many people who should have been paying closer attention. My father's consulting business had been struggling for several years in ways that had not been visible from outside the family and had not been fully communicated even within it. I've pieced this together afterward from conversations with my sister, who heard more than I did because she'd stayed in contact, and from things my mother eventually told me in the months after everything came apart. The short version is, the industry had changed, my father's firm had not changed with it. Several of his largest clients had left for competitors with more sophisticated technology offerings, and rather than restructuring or adapting, my father had responded to the losses by spending more maintaining appearances with a ferocity that was, in retrospect, the exact behavior you'd expect from someone whose identity is entirely bound up in how things look. They refinanced the house. They drew down savings. They took on debt in ways that were not visible to anyone who wasn't looking at the actual balance sheets, which included my mother, who had largely ceded financial management to my father years earlier, and I think had learned not to ask certain questions. The collapse happened in what felt from the outside like a very short time, though I now understand it had been eroding for years. My father's firm lost its last major client. There were debts that came due. There was a situation involving a business partner that I don't fully understand even now, and that I'm not sure I want to, involving loans that may or may not have been handled correctly. There were conversations with lawyers. There was a meeting about the house. My sister called me on a Thursday evening. She'd been crying. She said, "Something's really wrong with Mom and Dad." She told me what she knew, which wasn't everything yet but was enough. The house was likely going to have to be sold. The business was effectively over. There were financial obligations that needed to be met in the short term, and the resources to meet them were not there. She said, "Mom is not handling it." "I mean, she's handling the surface of it, but underneath she's completely..." She stopped. She said, "She needs you." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Marcus came into the kitchen where I was sitting at the counter in the dark and turned the light on and looked at me and said, "What happened?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should we do? Not what are we going to do? What do you want to do?" As if my feelings about it were the starting point of the conversation, not an afterthought. I said, "I don't know yet." "That's okay," he said, "take your time." He made tea and sat with me, and we talked it through for 2 hours, and what I arrived at by the end of those 2 hours was something more complicated than either vindication or obligation. What I felt was not satisfaction, or rather, there was a piece of something like satisfaction, some small, honest part of me that looked at the situation and thought, "You see now, don't you? You see what the things you valued were actually worth. You see how flimsy it was." And I felt that, and I acknowledged it to myself and to Marcus because I have learned over many years of therapy that the feelings you don't name tend to find their own way out. And then I set it aside, because it was a small and ungenerous feeling, and it was not the feeling I wanted to build my next actions on. The larger feeling was grief. I want to be very clear about that. I grieved for my parents' situation, because regardless of how they'd treated me, they were my parents, and watching the life they'd built, the life that had been used as both aspiration and weapon for as long as I could remember, come apart at the seams was not something I experienced as triumph. I thought about my father, who was 61 years old, who had run toward a particular version of success with single-minded determination for his entire adult life, and was now watching it dissolve. I thought about my mother, who had organized herself around that life, around those markers of arrival, around the good opinion of the right people, and who was now going to have to figure out who she was when those things were gone. I thought about the fact that the friends they'd spent 30 years collecting and cultivating were, as I was about to find out, a much more conditional set of relationships than anyone had allowed themselves to acknowledge. The first call from my mother came about a week after my sister had warned me. She called in the late afternoon, which was unusual. She'd always been a morning caller. I picked up on the second ring. There was a long pause before she said anything, the kind of pause that tells you someone has been rehearsing and then abandoned their script at the last moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you some things." And she told me everything, or close to everything. The business, the debt, the house. Her voice had a quality I'd never heard in it before, not weakness exactly, but exposure. Like a wall that's been stripped back to its bare structure. She told me she was sorry that she'd let things get to this point without telling me. I think she meant the financial things, but I also think she might have meant the other things, the larger things, and wasn't yet ready to say that directly. She asked if we could see each other. She asked it in the careful voice of someone who has considered the possibility of no, and is bracing for it. I said yes. Marcus came with me. He insisted, not in a controlling way but in the specific way of a person who loves you and wants to stand next to you when things are hard. He wore a clean shirt. He brought flowers, which I told him was not necessary, and he said he wanted to, and he brought them anyway, a simple bunch from the market, nothing elaborate. My parents were living temporarily in a rental apartment, the house having been listed. The apartment was fine. Normal. Exactly the kind of place my mother would have described, 2 years earlier, in a tone that would have made her opinion of it clear without her having to say a word. She opened the door when we knocked, and she looked at Marcus standing there with flowers, and something crossed her face that I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. A rearrangement, I want to call it. Like a picture that shifts when you look at it from a different angle. She took the flowers, she said, "Thank you, Marcus." She said his name without the particular careful tonelessness she'd used for it before. She said it like it was just his name. My father was in the kitchen. He'd aged visibly, which sounds like a cliché but is simply true. He looked like the past 2 years had been running at a different rate for him than for the rest of the world. He looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. Then he said my name, just my name, and his voice broke slightly on it, and I crossed the kitchen and we hugged for the first time in 3 years. It wasn't a clean moment. It was awkward and too long, and I could feel how thin he'd gotten. But it was real, and I'll take real over clean every time. We sat in the small living room of this rental apartment and we talked, and the conversation was the hardest I've had in my adult life, harder in some ways than the conversations that had preceded the estrangement, because those conversations had the clarifying energy of conflict, and this one had none of that to hold on to. There was just the four of us, sitting in afternoon light, trying to figure out how to be honest with each other after years of not being honest. My mother talked. My father listened more than he spoke, which was itself a change. At one point in the middle of a silence, Marcus said something quiet and practical about a situation they were dealing with, a specific financial knot they were trying to untie, and my father looked at him with what I can only describe as the first real look he'd ever given him. Not an evaluation, not a placement, just a look. In the weeks after that first visit, things developed in ways I hadn't predicted and couldn't have scripted. My parents' friends, the ones they'd spent years cultivating in the world of the right address and the right club and the right summer place, did what fair weather communities do when the weather changes. Some of them were kind in the surface way. Most of them drifted. One couple, people my parents had known for 20 years, who had been to their house for dinner dozens of times, who had sent Christmas cards and attended milestone birthdays, simply stopped responding. My mother called me to tell me about this, her voice carrying a specific bewilderment that broke my heart a little even as I recognized it. The bewilderment of someone discovering for the first time that the community they'd invested in was organized around status and not around them. I thought about Gloria, who had known Marcus for his whole life and would drive 3 hours in a storm if he needed her. I didn't say that, I just listened. Marcus, in the meantime, was being quietly extraordinary. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't revisit the wedding or the years of exclusion or the careful condescension he'd absorbed at dinners and family events without complaint. He helped, concretely, practically, without ceremony. My parents' rental apartment had plumbing issues, of course it did, and when my mother mentioned it in passing, almost apologetically, Marcus said, "I'll come by Saturday." He went. He fixed it. He refused to take money for it. My father, I was told by my mother, stood next to him the whole time, watching, asking questions, and then after it was done, made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table for an hour while Marcus told him about the business, about how he'd built it, about the specific satisfaction of diagnosing a problem precisely, and solving it efficiently and being trusted by clients because you'd earned it, and not because your name appeared in the right places. My father listened. Actually listened. My mother told me this when she called me that evening. She said, "Your father really likes Marcus." And then, after a pause, "I really like Marcus." And then, after a longer pause, "I'm sorry it took me this long to say that." I cried after I hung up. Not the frustrated, grieving crying I'd done in the early years of the estrangement. Something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. My sister had been watching all of this unfold and going through her own version of a reckoning. She and Todd were fine. They were stable, solid, but fine and solid aren't the same as examined. And I think the earthquake of our parents' situation had shaken loose some things in my sister that had been waiting to be shaken loose for a while. She started talking to me differently. Not less, but more honestly. She admitted things she'd never admitted before, that she'd been scared to diverge from the plan, that she'd looked at my life during the estrangement years with a complicated mixture of condemnation and something that might have been envy, that she'd spent a long time thinking I was reckless and was now reconsidering what reckless meant, and who had actually been reckless in the family and in what direction. She didn't blow up her life over any of this. She didn't need to. But she started asking herself questions she'd deferred. And I think that process, slow and unglamorous as it was its own kind of bravery. I went back to therapy to process what was happening with my parents, which sounds counterintuitive. Things were improving, why would you need therapy? But I've learned enough about myself to know that improvement and resolution are different things, and that the feelings I'd carried for 3 years, the grief and the anger and the complex guilt of knowing you'd done the right thing at real personal cost, didn't dissolve just because the external situation was resolving. They needed somewhere to go. My therapist helped me think about what I actually wanted from my parents, not what I was owed, not what the ideal scene would look like, but what a real, humanly imperfect reconciliation could actually be, what it needed to contain to be meaningful rather than just comfortable. She helped me understand that I could both forgive them and hold on to the knowledge of what had happened, that forgiveness didn't require rewriting history or pretending the 3 years hadn't been 3 years of real loss, that I could let them back in without erasing what it had cost to keep myself out. Marcus understood this better than I initially gave him credit for. He'd been gracious about my parents from the beginning, infuriatingly, impressively gracious, in the way of someone who doesn't need other people to be wrong in order to feel right about themselves, and as the reconciliation developed, he stayed exactly as he'd always been. Generous, steady, clear. He set one limit, clearly once, in a conversation he and I had at home about 3 months into the rebuilding. He said that he was glad for me, and he was happy to be part of rebuilding this relationship, and that his one condition was that if they ever spoke to me again the way they had spoken to me in the years of our courtship and early marriage, we were done with them. Not he was done with them, we were done with them. It was the most direct statement of solidarity I've ever received from another human being, and I had to leave the room briefly after he said it, because I was not going to cry in the kitchen. I had decided. I tell you all of this, the beginning, the marriage, the estrangement, the building of our life, the collapse. The return, because I think people tell stories like this as revenge narratives, and that's never been what this was for me. The satisfaction in this story, such as it is not the satisfaction of watching someone fall. It's not the satisfaction of being proved right, though I'll admit that when my mother looked at Marcus bringing flowers into her apartment and said his name plainly, without armor, something in me unclenched that had been tight for 3 years. Satisfaction, and I am going to name it even though it sounds immodest, is the satisfaction of having known something true about my life at a moment when everyone around me was telling me I was wrong, and of having held on to that knowledge through years of pressure and silence and loss, and of having been in the end correct. Not correct in the way of someone who beats someone else. Correct in the way of someone who trusted their own perception of what was good and real, when trusting it was costly. There is something else I want to say, about class specifically, because this story is about class whether it names itself that way or not. My parents' world was built around the belief that the value of work was legible in its financial return and its social location, that what you did mattered in direct proportion to how much it paid, and what kind of people it put you next to. Marcus's work in their framework was low. Necessary, certainly, they'd have acknowledged it was necessary the way you acknowledge that sewage treatment is necessary, but low. Unglamorous. Not the kind of thing that made you someone in their social vocabulary. The fact that it required skill and intelligence and discipline and the ability to manage a small business with integrity was invisible to them, or at least secondary, because it existed in a register they hadn't learned to read. What the collapse of their world clarified, for them and I think for everyone watching, was that the social value framework they'd built their lives around was not a description of reality, but a performance of it. A shared agreement among a group of people to treat certain things as important and certain things as not, an agreement that was maintained by proximity and consensus and fell apart the moment the consensus was removed. The friends who drifted when the money went were not bad people individually. They were just people who'd never had reason to examine what their friendships were actually based on, because the conditions that organized them had never been stressed. When those conditions disappeared, so did the fiction that had organized their social world. Marcus's world, by contrast, the world of Gloria's kitchen and Darnell's backyard and Pete with the arms, and the clients who'd been calling the same number for 5 years because it always got answered, was organized around something that didn't depend on conditions. It was organized around whether you showed up, whether you did what you said, whether you were someone that people could rely on. This isn't a romantic idea, it's not a political statement. It's just a description of what turned out to be durable and what turned out not to be, when pressure was applied. My father has said something to me in one of our recent conversations that I've been thinking about since. He said, I wasted a lot of time on things that didn't matter, and I didn't spend enough time on things that did. He said it without self-pity, which made it sadder and more real. I asked him what the things that didn't matter were. He said, the opinions of people who only knew us while we were useful to them. I asked him what the things that did matter were. He looked across the room at my mother, who was in the kitchen talking to Marcus about her garden. She's trying to grow tomatoes, which Marcus has opinions about, as he has opinions about all things horticultural, and he said, I'm working on that list. My mother has changed in ways I'm still measuring. She talks differently, not just to me, to people in general. There's a quality of attention she brings now that wasn't there before, or maybe was always there, and had been buried under 30 years of performance. She asks Marcus questions about his work that are genuine questions, the way you ask about something you actually want to understand. She calls me just to talk, not to check in on the progress of my life against a rubric. Last month she came with me to a fundraiser for the non-profit I work for and spent 2 hours talking to the people I work with, and afterward in the car she said, "These are remarkable people." She said it the way you say something when you mean it without qualification, and I thought, there you are. There is the person I always believed was in there behind the armor. Things are not resolved. I want to say that very clearly, because resolved would be dishonest, and I've promised myself I'd be honest in telling this. My father and I have not had the full conversation. There are things I've said, and things he said that are still in the space between us, not because we can't eventually address them, but because we're doing this slowly, and slowly is the only way to do it without it falling apart. There are still moments, rare but real, when I see a flicker of the old instinct in my mother, a slight recalibration when she's around people from the world she used to move in, a momentary return to the register of performance. I notice it. I don't say anything yet. I'm giving it room to finish resolving because I think it will, and because I've learned that demanding resolution on a timetable is a good way to get theatre instead of truth. Marcus's business is doing very well, which I mention not as a point-scoring exercise but because it's part of the story. He hired 2 more people this year. He's been approached about a second location, which we've had long conversations about at the kitchen table, weighing expansion against the things about the current size that we value. He's still the first one to answer the phone. He still shows up when he says he will. His reviews are still extraordinary, a fact that his mother reports to everyone she knows with a satisfaction that I find deeply endearing. Barnaby is now 5 and has somehow gained weight despite being a 3-legged dog who should by all rights be burning more energy than average. He sleeps at the foot of the bed. He has completely destroyed a throw pillow that Marcus bought at a market in Lisbon, an act of vandalism that Marcus reported to him directly, crouched down at dog level, with the firm and sorrowful tone of someone delivering news of genuine consequence, and which Barnaby received with the unbroken eye contact of someone who has not one iota of remorse. I am 31 years old. I have a husband I love with a completeness and specificity that I will never have the right words for. I have a life I chose. I have a family of origin that is imperfect and damaged and in the slow process of being repaired, and a chosen family that is warm and loud and always in the kitchen. I have a career that matters to me even on the days it doesn't pay enough. I have a dog. I have a tomato plant that is, against all odds and much early expressed skepticism on my part, actually producing tomatoes. And I have this particular thing that I've never said out loud fully to anyone but Marcus, at 2 in the morning on the night after my parents' first dinner at our house, when things had gone well and I'd sat up unable to sleep with the sheer accumulated weight of everything. The knowledge that the life my parents told me I deserved and the life I actually built are not even in the same universe of comparison, not in any way that disadvantages the one I built. The knowledge that the people they told me to admire and aspire to and organize my life around, those people dissolved when things got hard. And the people I found, the ones who showed up to my backyard wedding in their good clothes and laughed all night, and helped carry the chairs in when it started to rain, those people are still here. I know that sounds like the ending of the story. It isn't. 3 weeks ago my father called me on a Tuesday morning. Not evening, not afternoon, morning. He'd never called me in the morning in my entire adult life. I picked up and he said my name and there was a quality in his voice I couldn't immediately place, not distress exactly. Something more like the voice of someone standing at a threshold deciding whether to go through. I said, "Dad, what's wrong?" He said, "Nothing's wrong." A pause, then, "I need to tell you something. About some decisions I made, before everything happened. Things I did that I need to tell you before you hear them another way." And then before he could continue, My mother's voice came through in the background, sharp and urgent. Saying his name in that particular way she has, when something is happening that she wasn't prepared for. He said, "I'll call you back." He hasn't called back yet. It's been 3 weeks. I've called twice. Both times it went to voicemail. My sister says she doesn't know what it's about, but she says it in the voice she uses when she knows more than she's saying. Marcus says, he'll call when he's ready. Whatever it is, we'll handle it. I believe him. I believe we will handle it, whatever it turns out to be, because we have handled everything else, and because the thing we've built is the kind of thing that can hold weight. But I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared of what he was about to say. I'm not going to pretend I'm not checking my phone. I'm not going to pretend that after everything, after the estrangement and the rebuild, and the slow, genuine work of putting my family back together one honest conversation at a time, some part of me isn't braced for another floor to drop. Marcus is asleep. Barnaby is at the foot of the bed. The tomatoes my mother is growing in the planter outside are doing fine, I checked this morning. The world is, in most visible senses, all right. But my father called me on a Tuesday morning for the first time in my life, and started to say something and stopped. And I don't know what it was. And I'm still waiting.